When 118 passengers and 8 crew members boarded a brand new Boeing 737-400 at London's Heathrow Airport, they were bound for Belfast in Northern Ireland, a short 1-hour flight. Many of the passengers were business travelers returning to Belfast after a trip to London, while others were families visiting loved ones in Belfast and tourists returning home from the British capital. There were also 5 cabin crew and 2 pilots on board. Commanding the flight was 43-year-old Captain Kevin Hunt. Hunt was one of British Midland's most experienced pilots, having joined the airline 22 years earlier in 1966 at the age of 20. In that time, he had flown a wide range of aircraft and amassed an impressive 13,000 hours of flying experience. On this evening, however, his co-pilot was 39-year-old First Officer David McClelland. McClelland had just over 3,000 hours of experience, most of it in smaller, propeller-driven aircraft. He had joined British Midland the previous year when he was assigned to fly the 737. In that time, he had accumulated just under 200 hours on it. Neither pilot was a total stranger to the Boeing 737, having accumulated nearly 1,000 hours on the aircraft between them. But they were new to this particular variant of the 737, the 400 series, which had only been introduced the previous year. The new aircraft had an upgraded cockpit with modern CRT displays replacing the older analog gauges of the past. This was Boeing's response to the emerging threat of Airbus, which had just that year launched its ultra-modern A320 as a direct competitor to the 737. According to Boeing, pilots' lack of experience on this new plane shouldn't have been a problem. In what could be described as a signature move by the company, they had convinced regulators and airlines that pilots with previous 737 experience didn't need any advanced training, such as simulator time, to fly the new 737. All they needed was a few hours in the classroom and a booklet before they were ready to sit behind the controls of Boeing's newest product. This reduced training requirement saved the airlines millions, and Boeing even more in time and certification costs. By comparison, for an airline to buy Airbus's latest offering, it would have to send its pilots to the classroom and a full-motion flight simulator for months at a cost of about $1,000 an hour. The passengers of Flight 92 were about to pay dearly for Boeing's tactical marketing decisions. That's because there was more to this new iteration of the 737 than met the eye. There had been some significant changes to the way information was presented to the pilots and to some of the aircraft's key systems, such as the air conditioning and pressurization system. When the doors were sealed and the aircraft was pushed back from the gate at Heathrow, none of the passengers could have known that 2 pilots who had never had the opportunity to practice any in-flight emergencies or procedures in a 737-400 simulator were up front. First Officer McClelland taxied the brand-new aircraft to the runway at Heathrow, navigating the complex taxiway system while the captain carried out the pre-departure checks. Before they reached runway 28 that night, Flight 92 lined up on the runway, and McClelland began the takeoff roll. For the first few minutes after takeoff, everything was normal. The pilots accelerated and retracted flaps and gear. They monitored their instruments as the aircraft climbed on autopilot, and all engine readings were normal. It was a typically busy evening for London's airspace, and the pilots initially had to level off at 6,000 feet. However, they were soon cleared to 12,000 and shortly after to their cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The passengers settled in for the short trip, some eating, some reading, some chatting. But this normality was to be short-lived. Barely 15 minutes after takeoff, as it climbed through 28,300 feet, the plane began to shake violently. Overhead bins popped open and drinks and personal items began to slide off passenger tray tables. Loud bangs shook the plane and intermittent flames from an engine lit up the passenger cabin. Then a terrible smell of burning oil, rubber, and hot metal filled the cabin. In the cockpit, the pilots immediately turned to their engine instruments. The next few seconds would be critical. Hunt and McClelland would need all their mental resources to quickly and accurately determine the source and nature of the problem and to implement the appropriate procedures to resolve it. But at this critical moment, Captain Hunt made a split-second decision that would endanger the lives of everyone on board. Instead of bringing his vast experience to bear on the problem in front of him, he handed the job over to the less experienced first officer and took manual control of the aircraft himself. Now, the more experienced crew member was doing the relatively simple but attention-demanding job of manually piloting the aircraft, while the less experienced one was almost single-handedly responsible for diagnosing the aircraft's urgent problem. While the first officer scanned the instruments, the captain formed a mental picture of the problem. He had many hours on the previous generation's 737 and knew that on that aircraft the forward cabin was supplied with air from the right engine. Since he could smell burning, it made sense that the problem would be with the engine responsible for supplying air to the cabin, which in his experience was the right-hand engine. What neither pilot knew was that on a 737-400, the cabin air comes from both engines. So in reality, the fact that they smelled smoke told them nothing about which engine was having problems. But pilots don't make serious decisions like shutting down an engine based on their sense of smell. Fortunately, on this night, they had some state-of-the-art instruments at their disposal. The vibration meter for engine number 1, the left engine, showed 5 units of vibration, the maximum the instrument could display. The N1 indicator, which showed the speed of the fan at the front of the engine, fluctuated wildly. The exhaust temperature gauge was reading much higher than normal, and the fuel flow readings were fluctuating wildly. On the right-hand engine, engine number 2, everything was normal. The instruments painted a very clear picture. The left engine was having serious problems. But when Captain Hunt asked the first officer which engine was having problems, McClelland hesitated. On modern aircraft, the engine vibration meters are on a screen. The left gauge shows vibrations from the left engine, and the right gauge shows vibrations from the right engine. This instrument is one of the most important indicators of any problems with the engines, and that's where McClelland was focusing his attention. But on the 737-40 engine, layout, both engine vibration meters were located on the right side of the engine instrument panel. In the stress of the moment, as the first officer quickly took in the instrument readings, he saw a high vibration reading coming from the right side of the instrument panel. To make matters worse, in a cruel twist of irony, the very vibration the pilots were trying to locate was so strong that it was making it difficult for them to read the instruments. This effect was compounded by a phenomenon known as persistence of vision, where in a dark environment our eyes retain a trace of any light sources we look at for about a second. All these effects combined to create a perfect storm so that when McClelland looked at his instruments he hesitated before saying, It's the right one." Captain Hunt's suspicions were confirmed. He had already thought it was the right engine because he could smell smoke. He ordered McClelland to throttle back the engine, but the pilots were wrong. The engine instruments for the right engine showed that it was working perfectly. It was the left engine that was tearing itself apart. The passengers and cabin crew were all too aware of this. They could see sparks and jets of flame shooting back from behind the left engine. They had no idea that the pilots up front in the cockpit, with all their instrumentation, had overlooked this crucial fact. But just before the first officer throttled back the engine, there was one last clue that they had misidentified the problem engine, and it was a big clue staring them in the face. In the 11 seconds since the captain had disengaged the autopilot and taken over from the first officer, the aircraft had begun to roll to the left. In that short time, it had actually reached a bank angle of 16 degrees, a pretty significant departure from straight and level flight. The reason this was such a big clue is that the captain hadn't caused this turn. The engines had. With the fully functioning right engine operating at its normal power setting and the sputtering left engine producing much less thrust than normal, the aircraft had begun to be pushed to the left. This difference in thrust gave the pilots a clear indication that the problem engine was the left one. If it had been daylight, the pilots would have been able to see this turn clearly, but in the dark, with nothing to see out of the windows, the only indication that they were turning was the small artificial horizon in front of them, and they were so busy concentrating on the engine instruments that they simply didn't notice the turn. When the captain finally caught up with the plane, he didn't stop and think about why the plane had turned so much towards what he thought was the good engine. He just leveled the wings and flew on. But all these missed clues were nothing compared to what would happen next. Of course, you would expect that when the first officer reduced power to the right engine, the vibration and smoke would remain, clearly indicating that the left engine was the problem. This was not the case. That's because when McClend returned the right engine lever to idle, the captain also reduced power on the left engine to descend. And when the left engine was returned to idle, the vibration stopped and the smell of smoke disappeared. The pilots had received a misleading justification for their decision to throttle back the right engine. As far as they were concerned, they had just performed a textbook identification and resolution of an in-flight emergency. The rest of the flight would consist of finding an airport to divert to and telling the passengers the disappointing news that they wouldn't reach their destination tonight. The reality was that when the pilots reduced power on both engines, the excess fuel that was igniting in the left engine, causing the noise and vibration, had stopped entering the engine. That was what stopped the vibration. It had nothing to do with reducing power to the fully functional right engine. However, there was still plenty of time for the pilots to realize their mistake. Their instruments still showed the real story, that all their problems were with the left engine. The first officer radioed London Air Traffic Control, telling them they had an emergency situation, possibly an engine fire. There was no indication in the cockpit that there was a fire, but realizing that there might be one, Captain Hunt told McClend to shut down the engine. But before the first officer did so, the captain looked at the instruments and saw that the right engine was operating normally. He then told the first officer not to shut down the engine for the time being. Had Hunt checked the instruments a few inches to the left of the ones he was looking at, the truth would have been crystal clear. The next few minutes were busy as the first officer coordinated the diversion with air traffic control, and the captain radioed the company to update them on the situation. In the rear, the cabin crew told passengers to fasten their seatbelts. The worst of the shaking had stopped, but passengers were still in the dark about what was happening. Those sitting on the left side of the plane could see a jet of fuel coming out of the engine, but the fire had stopped, at least for now. After a few minutes, the pilots decided to divert to East Midlands. It was close, the runway was long enough, the weather was clear, and it was British Midland's main technical base. So Flight 92 set off for East Midlands. As soon as he was off the radio, the first officer announced that he was about to start the engine failure and shutdown checklist for the right engine. But just as he was about to do so, he checked the engine instruments. Of course, once again, Engine 2 looked perfectly fine. He said, "It looks like we've stabilized. We've still got the smoke." Again, he waited for the checklist and the right engine remained idle. But the pilot's window of opportunity to notice the clear discrepancy between the two engine readings would be brief. During a pause in the conversation between Captain Hunt and the airline's operations center, the first officer finally closed the fuel lever on the right engine. The fully functioning right engine, starved of fuel, began to wind down. McClend then started the auxiliary power unit, which took over some of the electrical load from the fading left engine. As the right engine shut down, the pilots noticed that the smell of smoke had cleared from the flight deck. This in turn reinforced their belief that the right engine was causing the problem and that they had done the right thing by shutting it down. But there was still hope that the pilots would see the error of their ways. In the rear were 118 passengers and 6 cabin crew, many of whom had experienced the engine problems firsthand. What better resource could a pilot want? The captain called the cabin supervisor into the cockpit. Today, in a similar situation, a captain would give the cabin crew what is known as a NITS briefing. N stands for the nature of the emergency, as in what actually happened. At this point, the captain would ask if the crew or passengers had seen anything that might help them understand the nature of the emergency. I stands for intention. In this case, the intention was to divert the aircraft to East Midlands. T is for time, i.e., how long before the aircraft will be on the ground. S is for special or relevant information concerning the safety of those on board. This includes whether passengers need to remain in their seats on landing, whether an evacuation is required, and if so, whether all doors are available. But in the 1980s and 1990s, this type of briefing was not yet widely used. So instead of conducting a full briefing or even asking what the cabin crew had specifically noticed, Hunt simply asked the cabin crew supervisor if he had seen smoke in the cabin. The supervisor said he had, and then Hunt quickly instructed him to clear the cabin and pack everything away. By failing to seek further information from his crew, Hunt missed the opportunity to find out that many of the crew and passengers had seen nothing untoward with the right engine, but had seen plenty of evidence from the left engine that it was not functioning properly. The cabin crew returned to the passengers and began to prepare them for the diversion. Flight 92 was now being vectored to the East Midlands by London Air Traffic Control. It would be on the ground in less than 15 minutes. The captain was still flying manually and talking to East Midlands operations, while the first officer was dealing with air traffic control and preparing the aircraft for its approach to the airport. It was a busy time in the cockpit, and the pilot's workload would only increase as they got closer. The passengers were becoming increasingly anxious. They were clearly descending, but the pilots had told them nothing about what was happening. What were they to make of all the flames, smoke, smells, and vibrations? The cabin attendant contacted the captain and told him that the passengers were starting to panic. Hunt decided to make a PA. In this PA, he told the passengers that there had been a problem with the right engine, which was responsible for the smoke they had seen in the cabin. He also said that the engine was now shut down and that the aircraft would land at East Midlands Airport in about 10 minutes. This announcement confused the passengers. Many of them had seen flames coming from the left engine. Why had the captain just said he had shut down the right engine? Perhaps he had misspoken, they thought, or perhaps there was something wrong with the right engine too, which they just couldn't see from their windows. After all, it was the pilots who had access to all the instruments up in the cockpit. Surely they knew what they were doing. Yet not one of the passengers made a comment to any of the cabin crew about what the captain had said, and the cabin crew didn't question the captain's mention of the right engine. Flight 92 continued its descent towards East Midlands, its left engine a ticking time bomb, hidden only by the fact that it was operating at a low power setting during the descent. As the flight approached East Midlands, the atmosphere in the cockpit was tense, and the workload for both pilots was heavy. As well as handling all the radio calls and getting the latest weather, the first officer was trying to program the approach to runway 27 into the FMS. In the heat of the moment, and still relatively new to the aircraft, he struggled. After a few minutes of trying, McClellan gave up trying to set up the flight management computer. The pilots would simply have to follow the air traffic control instructions to get to the airport. Finally, in a break in all communication with the ground, Captain Hunt decided to review the situation and said, "Well, what indications have we actually got? Just rapid vibrations in the aircraft? Smoke." This was the pilot's chance. They could take a few minutes to engage the autopilot, sit back and carefully review the indications they had received and the actions they had taken before continuing their approach to the airport. They had plenty of fuel and there was nothing forcing them to land immediately, believing they were flying with a fully functioning engine. But just as they were about to begin this review of the situation, air traffic control interrupted and passed to the next controller en route. After speaking to the controller, instead of continuing to review the situation, the first officer began reading the checklist for a single-engine inoperative descent and approach. The check they had just started was all but forgotten. Even as Mullen worked through this checklist, he was constantly interrupted by air traffic control giving the aircraft descent clearances and heading instructions. In all this activity, the pilots had allowed themselves to become bogged down with necessary but unimportant items at a stage of the flight when they needed to review their highly consequential decision to shut down one of the engines. Finally, after several interruptions, the first officer managed to complete the single-engine approach checklist. The aircraft was now prepared for a single-engine approach, and the pilots were mentally ready to execute it. It was something they had practiced many times in the flight simulator, but this was the first time they would actually do it. The aircraft was now 15 nautical miles from touchdown and descending through an altitude of 6,500 feet. Captain Hunt began to slow the aircraft and asked for the first stage of flaps to be extended. It had been a busy few minutes in the cockpit, but the aircraft itself appeared to be in good condition. Now all that was about to change. Leveling off at 3,000 feet, the captain increased thrust on engine number 1. Immediately, the vibration meter went to maximum deflection, but already convinced that they had shut down the correct engine, the pilots never thought to monitor it. The engine was now under tremendous stress. There was no guarantee that it would last until the plane touched down. As he lined up with the runway, Hunt began to descend again and called for more flaps. The first officer extended the flaps to 15 degrees and lowered the landing gear, and Flight 92 began its final descent towards the runway. They were now less than 5 miles from landing. With the flaps and gear extended, the aircraft was now experiencing much more drag than before. To maintain airspeed, Captain Hunt had to further increase the power on engine number 1. But as he did so, the extreme vibrations returned. Flames began to shoot from the back of the engine, and in the passenger cabin the shaking was so severe that many of the overhead lockers opened, spilling their contents on the terrified passengers. The engine sputtered and its thrust began to diminish. The captain pushed the throttle forward, but this only made the problem worse. The engine was now tearing itself apart. Just a few miles from the airport, the runway, now tantalizingly close, began to slide up the pilot's windscreens. At just 900 feet above the ground and still 2.5 miles from the runway, the left engine gave up completely. There was a sickening feeling as the plane, now powerless, began to fall. Captain Hunt immediately ordered the first officer to start the right engine, and Mullen desperately tried to relight it, but there simply wasn't enough time. The plane would hit the ground before the right engine had time to restart. In a desperate attempt to extend the glide path, Hunt raised the nose of the aircraft, but this had the opposite effect. It actually increased the drag on the plane and made its angle of descent even steeper. As the plane slipped lower and lower, it looked increasingly unlikely that the pilots would be able to make the runway. Bells and warnings rang out in the cockpit. The ground proximity warning system warned them of their deviation from the glide slope. The fire warning for engine number 1 sounded, and its red lights glowed in the center pedestal. Looking out their windscreens at the runway, the pilots could clearly see that their situation was now beyond saving. The captain quickly got on the intercom and told the passengers to prepare for an emergency landing. As the aircraft's speed dropped below 125 knots, the stick shaker joined the cacophony in the cockpit. It violently shook the pilot's controls, warning them that the aircraft was about to stall. The shaking continued all the way down as the plane descended and then slammed into the ground just short of the M1 motorway. It then bounced across the road and crashed into a wooded area on the other side of the motorway. The scene was one of utter devastation as the aircraft broke into 3 pieces. 47 passengers died and 66 others were seriously injured. 7 of the crew were also seriously injured, including both pilots. But what had caused the engine problems in the first place, and how could such an incredible reaction as shutting down the wrong engine be prevented in the future? As a direct result of the crash, all 99 737-400s in service were grounded. Analysis of the engines revealed that the fan blades of the upgraded engine used on the 737-400 were subject to abnormal vibration when operating at high power settings above 10,000 feet. On Flight 92, this vibration resulted in excessive metal fatigue, causing one of the fan blades to break off during the climb to cruise altitude. This critically damaged the engine and also upset the delicate balance of fuel and air, causing a reduction in power and an increase in vibration, which ultimately destroyed the engine when power was increased on final approach. As a result of the crash, the engines on the 737-400 were redesigned to eliminate the vibration that caused metal fatigue. But the most significant changes resulting from the accident were not in engine design but in pilot training. Pilots now receive extensive training in crew resource management, CRM, which includes giving NITS briefings to the cabin crew. Modern training also emphasizes the need for pilots to carefully consider every decision they make, taking as much time as necessary to do so safely, rather than acting quickly and making a wrong diagnosis. The training also teaches pilots to use automation to reduce their workload where appropriate. In this accident, Captain Hunt's decision to fly manually diverted his attention from identifying the problem engine at a time when he needed to focus on that. Subsequent versions of the 737, such as the 737NG and 737 MAX, have changed the way abnormal engine indications are presented to the pilot. Color coding and highlighting are used to alert pilots to critical or malfunctioning parameters. Following the accident, Captain Hunt and First Officer Maylen were sacked after the final report criticized their actions. British Midlands later paid Maylen an out-of-court settlement for unfair dismissal, and Captain Hunt claimed that he and his colleague were sacked because it was the easy option for the airline, rather than taking a hard look at its training practices and at systemic problems in the industry. However one chooses to apportion responsibility, there is no denying that the impact of this accident on the aviation industry has been monumental. Flying is safer today because of the lessons learned from Flight 92. This video is dedicated to those who lost their lives so that these safety improvements could be made.